Ciao, this is Giuseppe Camuncoli, aka Camo, from Italy, and you're listening to the Amazing Spider Talk.
Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. In 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The Amazing Spider Talk. The Amazing Spider Talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the Amazing Spider
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gvozden, and I'm the founder and editor of SuperiorSpiderTalk.com.
And I'm mischievous Mark Ginocchio, the founder of the Chasing Amazing blog and the author of 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for the 5th episode of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as they look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture.
In this first season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk, Dan, we've been taking a closer look at the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko creative run on the title. So last time around, we talked about all the recurring tropes and themes that have defined Spider-Man's life and all of his great famous stories. But today, rather than looking at story ideas and themes, we're going to look more individually at the the bad guys. I didn't do it, Dan. I bet you thought I was going to do it, but I didn't do it.
I am crossing my fingers on this one. Yep, but like Mark said, we're talking about the bad guys, and so that's going to span this whole run. We're not talking about a particular issue. We're just talking about Lee and Ditko's contributions as a whole, and that means you can read it just about anywhere, whether it's print, digital, or on Marvel's Unlimited service. Again, this remains one of the most published, most read series of comic books in the world. You can trip over these things, maybe not in print, but you can trip over them just about anywhere and catch up with us to read them. So I guess sit back, everybody, and get ready for Mark. I'm going to let you do it this time.
The bad guys.
All right, here we go.
The villains, I think, are the most important people in a story, because in a running series, because you've already met the hero. You know who the hero is, you know who the hero does, and if the hero wasn't fighting some unpredictable guy or girl or something, monster, who you didn't feel the hero didn't have a chance to defeat, then there'd be nothing to interest you. So the first thing you have to do with a villain, for those of you who are villain writers, the first thing you have to do is get a villain who seems to be unbeatable by the hero. It seems the hero has no chance to beat this guy. Then, of course, it makes your job tougher, because you have to figure out, well, how will the hero beat him? Because he has to at the end, unless you want to kill the series, which could happen too. So it's important to get villains that are very powerful. I like to get villains that have some sort of a background, so I know a little bit about their personal life, just like I like to know a little about the personal life of my heroes.
All right, Dan, we're going to talk about the well, I won't do Tony Montana anymore, but we're going to talk about all the villains and just to kind of organize this, and also maybe to even create some debate amongst us or our fans. I thought we would kind of organize these villains by tier, aka like their importance. So let's start with those tier 1 villains that Lee and Ditko created. I mean, just for the record, Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery is considered by many to probably be the best in superhero comics, maybe the second best to Batman, depending on what your taste in comic books are. So, tier 1 here, again, we're looking only at villains created during the Lee and Ditko years. So that's Amazing Fantasy 15 and Amazing Spider-Man's 1 through 38, annuals 1 and 2. The first, what I consider to be tier 1 villain to show up is the Vulture, whose first appearance was Amazing Spider-Man number 2. Obviously, the star of Spider-Man Homecoming. Do you have any objections to the Vulture being here, Dan?
No, I don't. Although I feel like he's kind of become a tier 2 villain, as time has gone on, which is funny to reflect on the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko era, because they clearly had no idea that this character would be around for as long as he would be. I mean, who could possibly have imagined,
Yeah.
And they moved him out of high school quickly and yada yada yada, and the same goes with the villains. I don't think they had any idea what villains were going to stick around or catch on or really even work with this character. We get aliens in the second issue, and so that the Vulture is kind of this big villain in the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko run seems kind of strange now, because he's not that big of a character in the comics anymore, although he got his own movie just a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, no, I agree with you. He is one of the big villains in this run, but it's funny to see him there, I think, given the history of the character. Yeah,
and just, in terms of why, I think he belongs in tier 1. He was the first villain that Spider-Man fought a second time around. He first appeared in ASM 2 and then showed back up again in ASM 7. I think he's kind of a good thematic counterpart. Roger Stern has always said that he loves the Vulture because he's really the antithesis of Spider-Man in every way. It's youth and ingenuity and kind of natural power versus age and craftiness and technological advancements and things like that. And then, like you said, the movie, I think, elevates him. And for what it's worth, when during the Sam Raimi movies, they were going to use the Vulture in those movies as well until that franchise, that series petered out. So and not to go too far ahead, he's one of the few guys that kind of resurfaces during the Romita run. A lot of these guys would just kind of disappear for a long period of time, and he would reliably come back over and over again. Yeah. And just a fun little note about his creation. So apparently when Stan Lee was first pitching this idea of having a quote unquote flying bird like villain, what he originally pitched to Ditko was he wanted a heavy set mobster type character to play the Vulture. And Ditko's reaction to that was then it's going to look like Spider-Man's fighting a turkey. So he opted to make the Vulture, what he ended up looking like. And it sounds like, because Stan Lee was noted for when, if at first he doesn't succeed, he just finds another artist to do it the way he wants it. So he ended up going to, I think it was Bill Everett in Daredevil, to get his rotund bird-like villain with the owl, Leland Owlsley, for Daredevil. So that was kind of where Stan's original vision for this villain kind of manifested itself, which is just a fun little aside note, but nothing to do with his importance to Spider-Man. And Spider-Man would get his own rotund villain, 50 issues later with the Kingpin. Yes. Yeah. Yes, which is, some people believe that was the other course of action for, Stan getting his way. Okay, it won't be a bird villain, but I'll still get his fat mobster villain. So, all right, who's next? Next up, and I think this is a pretty obvious choice, is Dr. Octopus, who first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 3. I don't feel this needs any justification. Do you have any justification for it? No. Any way to unjustify it, Dan? He is the guy. He is the villain. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll get to we'll talk about him in a little more detail in a minute. But let me just kind of vis-a-vis another villain on this list. But just to kind of run through this list a little more. The next one I thought was a good tier 1 villain was SANDMAN, who first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 4. SANDMAN what's very interesting about Sandman is I feel that he's almost too powerful to be a Spider-Man villain. And that kind of showed in the fact that they kind of ushered him over to Fantastic Four after a couple of years in Spider-Man, right?
Is it that he's too powerful, or that like it's difficult for writers to come up with a way for Spider-Man to beat him?
Yeah, well, there's that too. But like, I mean, he's a character that can, fix, shape it and manipulate his density and his shape and his size. And, I actually find the fight that Spider-Man has against Sandman in Amazing Spider-Man number 4 to be one of my favorites, because it's just sheer Ditko craziness with him like ending up using a vacuum cleaner at the end to get him. I mean, I think that's pretty brilliant personally, although
the
I guess
visualizations look like something out of The Thing. It's really kind of creepy with him like just being like a head on a tail and stuff like that.
Yeah. But definitely, I mean, Sandman has been around forever. He's been in the Sinister Six. He obviously fought Spider-Man a number of times during this run, and always kind of seemed to show up when Spider-Man was at his most vulnerable, which I always thought was interesting. Like there's that 3-parter where Spider-Man quits, hence the air quotes, which you can't see me using on your podcast. But where Sandman kind of resurfaces. So for me, that's why he belongs on here. And then, yeah, he ended up becoming a part of the Frightful Four and more of a Fantastic Four and Human Torch villain explicitly. Like there was that, years later, there's that great Marvel Team Up #1, the Christmas issue, where Spider-Man is literally like he's out shopping for a gift for Gwen Stacy, and Sandman shows up, and Human Torch is like there too, and Spider-Man's like, well, he's your villain now, you could take care of him.
I always felt like they made him a good guy eventually for that brief period of time that he was a good guy and even was on the Avengers, just because they had a hard time coming up with different ways of defeating this very powerful character.
Yeah, definitely. Next on the list might be considered more controversial.
But your favorite.
One of my favorites. So I threw Mysterio in tier 1. I mean, he definitely shows up multiple times during this run, which I think adds to it. I always found that he was one of the more creative villains. And he also, like, almost all the villains, I feel like he plays most into what Lee and Ditko more so were going for in Spider-Man's universe, which is this idea of like these grounded street level villains that could still get a number on a super powered hero. I mean, with Mysterio, I mean, his origin is that he's, a special effects guy gone rogue. So he uses his knowledge of special effects. I mean, yeah, there's some suspension of disbelief of what he's able to pull off. But he uses those powers to manipulate, but he's not super powered. He doesn't have nuclear abilities or cosmic abilities. I mean, he's just manipulating visuals to mess with Spider-Man. What are your thoughts on Mysterio?
He's got an unending budget also.
Yeah,
like,
well,
this guy has got some money to spend. Yeah, I think he gets some, an additional boost by being a member of the original Sinister Six as well. He's a guy I often forget was a part of the Sinister Six, because he just seems like an odd fit for the rest of that group. But he is there, unlike some of the other ones who are actually going to be on like our tier 2. But yeah, I mean, I guess just on the fact that he reappears several times in this run bumps him up a little bit. I think he's missing some of the personal connection that some of these other villains have, and I think in terms of his characterization, he's probably the flimsiest of the bunch. Like, I don't think we really ever got to know Quentin Beck all that well, other than that he's this flashy showman kind of guy. But he also dresses up as Spider-Man and commits crimes, and to me, that's like a cardinal sin enough to bump you up on the list.
Yeah. And I mean, his first appearance was Amazing Spider-Man number 11, but I feel like his true time to shine was actually issue 24, when he like poses as a psychologist or shrink and almost gets Spider-Man to admit his secret identity, and he basically convinces Spider-Man that he's going crazy. And it's like, got great Ditko visuals, and I mean, it's just to me like a really well executed story that kind of shows how, yeah, I mean, he's a flimsy character, but he has this really uncanny ability to almost get one over on Spider-Man each time he shows up, which I think is pretty cool.
I wish we got to see that side of the character more often. I feel like it, all too often Mysterio falls into big, unbelievable spectacle that you can't really believe. But
right.
The kind of more twisted, psychologically trickster stuff I think is more interesting. I think about that Dan Slott story from Brand New Day where he convinces Spider-Man that he murdered someone.
Right.
Like that's really interesting to me. And I think he could be more like small, clever, and devious and be more interesting as a character.
Definitely. And then the last of the Tier 1 villains here, and I don't think there's going to be much argument here, is the Green Goblin, who first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 14. Of course, during this run, we never revealed who the Green Goblin was. He was introduced as this mystery villain, and that mystery maintained through the duration of this creative run, which leads me to, I think, one of the big questions in all of Spider-Man fandom, Dan: Doc Ock or Green Goblin? But let's do it. Let's couch the argument just on this run.
I don't know, Mark. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think from this run, it's got to be Doc Ock, because I just don't think Green Goblin, there's that mystery component to him, but I just don't think he really attains the gravitas, of the character until after this run. But at the same time, like, the Otto's best story in this run is like basically the one he's not even in. Like, the master planner, he's like an afterthought to the best part of that story.
Yeah, but it is interesting in what ends up being Spider-Man's most personally daunting story that the antagonist ends up being Otto, even if he's not really that much of a factor. And he was also involved, I feel, earlier in the run with the death of Betty Brant's brother.
Yeah.
What's that? What's his name? Bennett. Thank you. I think we did this last episode. So that kind of like sets Spider-Man's love life on its head, which I think is important. Obviously, Otto is the leader of the Sinister Six, and even brilliantly plots it so that each one attacks attacks Spider-Man individually, rather than just 6-on-1, which you would think a supergroup would just do and beat him. I feel like I'm Scott Evil here. Like, just shoot him. You're 6 supervillains. Just team up and kill him.
It is particularly dumb.
Yeah. And of course, Otto's got the thematic counterpart to Peter. I mean, they're men of science based on eight appendaged creatures. and one uses his power responsibly and one uses it for nefarious purposes. I mean, it's a very thematic thing, but obviously the Green Goblin would go on to develop more cachet after this run. But it is always interesting to me that of all the villains, the Goblin was the one earmarked for this very long, slow burning mystery angle that they keep up throughout the whole thing. So it makes me think that even if the duration of this run, Otto was the focus, they had plans for the Green Goblin.
It's funny because I think the Green Goblin is just kind of an odd villain for Spider-Man to fight in this run, where so many of his villains are like animal based and all. He kind of stands out, and I wonder, like, if there wasn't that mystery element to the Green Goblin, would he even have come back? I don't really think there's a lot that's really that compelling about him. I mean, his first story is like one of the most ludicrous stories ever. The like luring him to Hollywood thing.
Let's have a movie.
Yeah, and like, okay, now you guys can push this boulder on top of him, and then the Hulk shows up. It's just kind of nutty, and I feel like if there wasn't the mystery, he wouldn't really come back. And I think if I were a reader, I'm trying to put myself in the place of a reader. in the 1960s of this comic, who would I be more excited about? I mean, I think I might think that Otto is a cooler villain and a more compelling villain, but I also might have been very interested in finding out the Green Goblin's identity because they were teasing it. Yeah. But I think at the end of the day, I have to go with Otto because he's just the better villain.
Yeah. Just as a side note, with the creation of the Goblin, apparently Stan's initial vision for the character was he wanted him to be a demon trapped in a sarcophagus or something like that.
Yeah.
And Ditko was like, no. Absolutely not. And I don't think Stan ever got to do that elsewhere in Spider-Man. At least not in a significant way.
Maybe Morbius?
Maybe. But Morbius was Roy Thomas, so, you know.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. And then, of course, obviously, there will be the famous fallout over who the identity of this character is.
Right. But that might be a topic for another episode, Dan.
I think so.
There is one more villain, if you will, that we didn't mention, but probably based on his importance to the overall story of Spider-Man, should be considered tier 1. Who would that be, Dan?
I think that would have to be the Burglar.
Yeah.
Did we ever get the Burglar's name?
I don't think so. Maybe in Amazing 200 we do, when he's, you know,
I can't remember him
for
being
Silverfish
addressed by name.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But yeah, I mean, certainly he only shows up once in this run, and but he's the one that sets everything into motion. So you gotta consider him. And he would only
according to Wikipedia, his name is never revealed.
There we go.
We're safe. We were
so
both
he's not like Joe Cool, right?
Correct. There is a rumor that like his last name might be Carradine.
Yeah, I think I heard that somewhere.
And Dennis Carradine has been used in the media over the years, but it's never appeared in Amazing Spider-Man that way.
Of course, we're remiss to say that the Burglar actually worked with Flint Marko in killing. I'm kidding. Flint Marko being the Sandman, but no.
But yeah, what do you think? Does the murder of Uncle Ben, and the creation of Spider-Man essentially qualify this guy for tier 1?
I think so. I think the fact that he basically sets everything into motion. Without the Burglar, there really is no Spider-Man. There is no heroes and villains. So I think it needs to be. It's kind of, I mean, you know, I made the joke about Joe Cool before, but it's like thinking about the burglar who kills, or, you know, the robber who kills Bruce Wayne's parents. I mean, you know, it's just an essential moment, an essential origin moment for one of the greatest superheroes of all time. So I think you just have to. It's almost like if he's not tier 1, he's just on his own pedestal, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Or originating villains, the element of a creation story, you know, that's got to be on its own thing. So let's move into tier 2 villains. Mark, what are our qualifiers to be a tier 2 villain from the Lee Ditko run?
Yeah, I mean, I think a tier 2 villains is either characters who made multiple appearances during this run, but maybe kind of got forgotten down the road, and or characters who only showed up once or during this run, but ended up becoming more important down the line. Does that make sense to you?
And I think this is where it's going to get controversial.
Yeah.
Between you and I.
Yeah. Let's run the list first, and then we can pick our arguments, if that makes sense.
That sounds fine to me. All
right. So for tier 2. I put forward the Chameleon, whose first appearance is Amazing Spider-Man #1, the Lizard from ASM 6, Electro from ASM 9, Big Man and the Enforcers from issue 10, Kraven from issue 15, Scorpion from issue 20, Spencer Smythe and the Spider Slayers from issue 25, and Molten Man from issue 28. So, Dan, what are some of your issues there?
I think my big one, and I feel like you have a reason why you put him on tier 2, is the Lizard, mainly because, he's a villain that we get, and he hangs around in the book as like a prominent character, even in the Master Planner story. But I guess the reasoning why I would even argue against myself on this is, like, he kind of ceases to be a villain almost immediately, and moves into a supporting character role.
Right.
So I don't know, but I think like there's something more to the Lizard than, say, Electro and Chameleon, who kind of make their appearances and go away. But the Lizard and Electro are both on the Sinister Six, so...
Well, Lizard isn't Sinister
Oh, you're
Six.
right. No, the Lizard isn't. Just Electro is.
Yeah. I don't know if he ends up on a later version of the Sinister Six. But yeah, I mean, Lizard is... I almost wonder if Lizard kind of belongs on his own kind of stand where the Burglar is. Because he's this very... Of all the villains, he, in many ways, is the most complicated in that, certainly in the early days, and even until very recently when, like, that Brand New Day story, like, he was treated as, like, someone that, like, Spider-Man could never truly confront because, underneath his reptilian skin, he's a good man, who just accidentally turned himself into this monster. He's basically Spider-Man's Hulk without, being an Avenger, I guess. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So I could see your issues there. Who from this list do you feel could be elevated into tier 1 now? Like putting aside their own this run, like, has gone on. I mean, there's someone that immediately jumps out to me, but I'm curious if you're on the same wavelength as me.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, Kraven.
Yeah.
Electro. I mean, Electro is one of the most frequently reused villains in Spider-Man, weirdly enough. Or it's come to be the case.
Yeah, which is weird because if you actually go back in time with Electro, he's used in issue 9, and then he shows up on the Sinister Six. And then he's, like, nowhere to be found until, at least in Spider-Man's world, until years later when Ramita's on the book.
Yeah.
And then I feel like even during, like, the Bronze Age, like, they came up with the Shocker, who, I mean, it's not the same villain, but they're similar. You know what I mean? There's a similar kind of...
Sure.
To them. And I feel like the Shocker kind of took over more during the Bronze Age. But yeah, certainly over the last decade or so, I feel like Electro has shown up a lot.
Yeah. I would actually, on this list, even, like, demote a few people.
Yes, I think some could definitely be demoted. Who would you demote? Like
the Chameleon. I know people like the Chameleon, but, like, the guy, I mean, talk about a guy who disappeared for a while.
Yeah.
And even now, like, he is... almost a footnote. I could never imagine the Chameleon getting a movie of his own in the way that a lot of these other people do. And in this run, he appears once and isn't even a full issue of the Chameleon.
It's interesting because I always feel like he was really a lame villain to start Spider-Man's own book with. Like, here's this character who had the sensational debut issue in Amazing Fantasy, and the first guy you have him fight is basically like this Cold War spy. You know what I mean? Like, master of disguise. Like, it just shows very little creativity, in my opinion.
I agree. Although I do like the element that, like, the Chameleon allows for there to be confusion about who Spider-Man is and plays into the whole, like, masked persona thing.
That's fair. My argument about demoting him would be, he does end up playing a key role in a couple of significant stories down the line. I mean, like I know he wasn't the total mastermind behind like the reappearance of Peter's parents, but he was a secondary key figure, if you will.
He does have that great cover of Spider-Man about to smash him with a tombstone.
Yes.
For what that's worth.
Right. I feel that certainly the Red-Headed Stranger story during Brand New Day was a pretty significant Chameleon story, and kind of like he was used in the right context there to kind of throw things off with Mary Jane after her return. And then he is technically on the Sinister Six right now for whatever that group's existence is.
That's true. I mean, I just feel like the Chameleon is a guy who, he's a cool villain, and he's been, bumped up in the Spider-Man mythology mainly because he was included in the animated series from the 90s and has kind of made appearances here and there, but it never really got a real foothold in the pages of the comic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he just, like, what do you do with this guy? Like, they tried changing his powers here and there and gave him that, like, rainbow suit, which the less said about the better. I mean, he's a character the writers can't even consistently write his powers right.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
And then obviously another character here I would demote would be the Enforcers. I mean, but they were used quite a bit during this run. They were like always kind of there to be like the hired muscle to mess around with things with Spider-Man. And the Big Man is technically the first masked mystery villain that Spider-Man dealt with. But obviously, well, like the Enforcers have shown up since then, but they're jokes now, right? I mean, is that a safe assessment?
Yeah, but I think they belong on this list. Especially for this run.
Okay, yes, for this run, absolutely. But I feel like if we were to make like the master Spider-Man villain list, I wouldn't put them in tier 2.
I would even put this version of the Enforcers below the ultimate version of the Enforcers, which I think are way more fun.
Okay, that's cool. I'm down with that.
Okay, what about the Scorpion? Because I think I like the Scorpion more than you do.
Yeah, I've just never been a huge Matt Gargan fan. I mean, I just find his whole creation, I mean, to me, and he's not on this list because quite frankly, he's going to get his own episode, spoiler alert, down the road. But to me, the Scorpion is a creation of J. Jonah Jameson. You know what I mean? Without Jameson trying to, in his obsession with Spider-Man. And I know you could say the same about the Spider Slayers, but like, I feel like the Smythe family and stuff would kind of, they would develop their own little issue with Spider-Man down the line. But the Scorpion, I don't know. Like, he just seems like a thug who lucked into some powers, which we will see in some tier 3 villains. Yeah, I don't know. And then I know he had the run with Venom, but I always kind of found that to be a creative low point for the Venom character, giving him to Gargan. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm just not sold on the character.
I'll tell you what I like about the Scorpion.
Sure.
So hear me out on this one. I think first of all, I feel like the Scorpion is like the first true iteration of Jameson creating a villain. Which would go on to haunt Jameson forever. And I find that really interesting.
Okay.
And it's also one of the few early times where Spider-Man, I mean, I guess you could say like the issue 5 with Dr. Doom, where he has to save Flash Thompson, is an instance of this, but it's also an instance of Spider-Man has to save Jameson from himself, and I think that's really interesting. For the character is, this Scorpion, I may not agree with Jameson, and I may not really even have much to do with this at all, but I have to risk my neck to save someone because it's the right thing to do. And I also just love the fight in that issue because Spider-Man gets like beaten to a pulp, and it really feels like the stakes are high because it's in the Bugle. So I don't know. I mean, I guess he's kind of a minor villain, but I think he's got an added personal wrinkle to him that makes him interesting. Because it's also the inversion of Peter. It's like a guy who didn't really want powers and now like kind of wants to get rid of them, but can't. There is a kind of a bit of a mirror to Spider-Man with this character.
All right.
Does any of that land for you?
Yeah, no, I think the stuff with kind of haunting Jameson lands the most.
Okay.
So.
I'll take what I can get.
All right. So tier 3. Tier 3. These are the bums. These are just villains that have had very little impact. And there might be some, nits to pick here, but let's just run through this.
I just want to say, they might be the bums, but a lot of these have a really close place to my heart.
That's fair. So we have the Tinkerer from ASM2.
Yeah.
The Crime Master, which might be the most controversial on this list, from issue 26. The Looter from 36. Gaunt from 37. Mendelstrom and the Robot Master, /the Robot Master from 37. Also, I'd be remiss to say the Living Brain from number 8. And the Cat Burglar from number 30. What I find most interesting about a lot of these characters is most of them come in the later half of the run, which I think says something about where the creative juices were flowing by this point.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So close to your heart, maybe, but outside of the Crime Master, who really is just more compelling because he was kind of inserted into this mystery angle with the Goblin when he first appeared, although like the upshot was he was a nobody. So like we're just kind of like, oh, okay. like nobody cares who this guy is. It's who he is unimportant. It was just that he was a mystery.
He got like the first real compelling multi-issue arc.
Yeah, and it's a great story. I mean, so like that I guess gives it some juice. And then they would reuse the Crime Master down the line. But most of these other villains, outside of an appearance here and there, or kind of used as a joke, have not reappeared. Tinkerer, for whatever it's worth, does show up as Phineas Mason in Spider-Man Homecoming. Do you think that gives the character a little more panache now? Or, I mean, is he still a guy who basically turned out to be an alien?
I mean, his first appearance aside, I think the Tinkerer has kind of gone on to have a much bigger life in the Marvel Universe. Like, even now in Spectacular Spider-Man, we're dealing with, the Tinkerer's brother, which, right. I mean, give me a break. But, you're digging, into a really uninteresting part of the Marvel Universe when you're dealing with the Tinkerer's unheard-of brother. I guess the movie elevates the Tinkerer a bit, and he has been behind a lot of Spider-Man's villains over the years. I was thinking about the Paul Jenkins run. He's behind half the villains in that. Compared to Gaunt, the Tinkerer has a very healthy lifestyle.
But hey, Gaunt shows up in Revelations, man, so...
That is true. That is very true.
And the Robot Master shows up in that great Civil War II's tie-in that we enjoyed.
That's true, and the Robot Master, a.k.a. Mendelstrom, has a great story in the Paul Jenkins run.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about the Looter, because this is, of all the villains, I feel this one kind of epitomizes the ultimate disconnect between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Here they are on this great run of stories, and pretty much from about issue 10 on, Ditko was a one-man show and Lee would just come in towards the end and write in dialogue and stuff like that. But apparently, and if you look at your last page of Amazing Spider-Man number 35, there's this great thing where Ditko just sketched out the Looter in the teaser for next issue, but never told Stan about it. So the teaser for next issue, for issue 36, his first appearance, was here's a villain so cool we don't even have a name for him yet, because Stan was just who the hell is this guy?
and even the name would be inconsistent because he shows up as the Meteor Man.
Yes. And you could just tell, Stan wants nothing to do with this character. He calls him a crackpot or whatever, and it's within the first issue, a page of dialogue about it, or narration about him. And this character basically is Ditko's Ayn Rand obsessed objectivism on steroids, right? I mean, he's this, loser character who isn't good enough, to do anything on his own, ends up lucking into these powers and essentially becomes a taker, as Rand or Ditko or Paul Ryan would call it. And I mean, what else can there really be said about this character? I mean, he's a joke, right?
He literally gets his powers from meteor gas.
Yes.
I mean, that's the thing.
And
and his parachute is like probably his greatest like addition to his super strength.
Right. But and the key to it too, again, it's like it's this obsession before his transformation to the fact that like he's like, I could do this, but I didn't graduate and I didn't, I don't have enough money and blah 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 blah. You know what I mean? It's like this character has all these excuses, which we'll talk about the whole Ayn Rand thing when we have our episode about Ditko down the line. But like these are the core tenets of that philosophy that that those who the industrialists and the makers, so to speak, of the world are the ones to be valued and idolized, and those who are just complaining and looking for handouts and whatever, the looters, as they're even called in Atlas Shrugged, I believed.
Well, I gotta say, Mark, I love the looter. Every time he shows up, I just jump with joy.
Well, isn't this your first Lee issue?
It is. It's the first Lee Ditko issue that I ever owned. And for that reason, because I love the looter. I have a commission of the looter hanging on my wall right in front of me right now.
Yeah, who did that one for you? Is that Ron Friends? Or?
No. It's a friend of mine, Tim, who every time I see him at a convention, I get him to do like a D-list Spider-Man villain for me.
Right.
So I have a growing wall of D-list villains, including everybody's favorite Swarm and Razorback and Boomerang and you name it. But the looter is the most prominent. I just love how much of a loser this guy is. Enough that when he appeared, I think it was during the Big Time run, he like appeared in an issue. And then somebody was like, "Who are you, the loser?" And he was like, "No, I'm the looter." And then they like kick him off the side of the building.
There you go.
Great stuff. He is a great punching bag for me. I'm all about the looter.
Yeah. Before we wrap this conversation, let's talk about some other people's villains that showed up during this run. I mean, these were obviously not Ditko Lee creations, but they do it obviously went on to play a key role in one way or another. There's Dr. Doom, of course, who showed up in Amazing Spider-Man #5 and almost killed poor Eugene Flash Thompson. Doom, of course, needs no introduction. Although, like, I mean, there would be other Spider-Man Doom stories, but like, he never really. I never feel like those two truly bothered with each other, right? No,
not like. I think even in like the best Dr. Doom Spider-Man story, which is that like airport reunion issue.
Right.
Like, I don't even know if Doom truly acknowledges Spider-Man's presence beyond like sending a couple Doom bots at him. He's just like, whatever. Like, you're just in my way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's the Ringmaster, who first showed up as an Incredible Hulk villain, but he would show up a couple times in this run. He showed up in Amazing Spider-Man #16, which was a Daredevil team up, where he hypnotizes an entire circus that Spider-Man is at, except for Daredevil, right? Because he's blind.
Right.
Has his advantages. Then with the what was it? The circus crime. What was the circus crime group? They're
the Circus of Crime.
The Circus of Crime. That she shows up. Was that issue 21, I believe? With this, or it's 22. It's with the spider signal on the cover.
Yeah, and Princess Python and all those people.
Yeah, that's it. I think we only remember Ringmaster and Princess Python. No one else remembers the rest of them.
That's all that matters, really.
Yeah. And then there's the Beetle, who showed up in Amazing Spider-Man #21. Was actually created as a Human Torch villain in Strange Tales in 1964 before coming over. But like, he's ended up kind of playing a role in Spider-Man. I mean, he's also continued to kind of fight Human Torch, but he would become part of the Sinister Syndicate and, of course, the Deadly Foes of Spider-Man in the 90s. And then Abner Jenkins, the character who played the Beetle, had a number of amazing appearances in Superior Foes of Spider-Man. I mean, walking through walls because he can't jump out a window.
Yeah, the Beetle has kind of been co-opted to become a Spider-Man villain instead of the other way around.
Yeah. So, pretty interesting.
I want to talk about the villains overall because I think it's fascinating that, like, outside of maybe, like, Venom and the Rhino, like, there have been very few villains in Spider-Man's history that have really hung around that weren't created during this time. Why do we think that is?
Yeah, I mean, Kingpin obviously is another one you would have to consider.
Yeah, and maybe Morbius. And,
right.
Moreland.
Right, but the point being, there are significantly more villains created during this run that hung around versus the villains created in the almost 50 years after, more than 50 years after. If you look at it strictly from a ratio standpoint, which is just incredible. And not only have they hung around, but these are great comic book villains. I mean, they're part of some of the most memorable stories in comic book history. I mean, Kraven showed up and, obviously is the villain in Kraven's Last Hunt. Kraven's Last Hunt is considered one of the best comic book stories ever, not just Spider-Man stories ever. There's something to be said about that, right?
Yeah. Why do you think that is? I mean, is it because these issues were created in a time where villains didn't need to have as complicated of a origin, and so it kind of left them to be a blank slate for other writers to fill in more interesting details? Like, what is it about? Is it just that they were there at the get-go? Like, what is it that makes these villains hang around longer than other ones that might have been created in a more modern sensibility?
I just think it speaks to the creativity of Lee and Ditko. I mean, and probably more so Ditko, because, the main other artist that Lee was working with during this time was Kirby. And obviously Kirby created a ton of hits, but he was doing so much that, the hits were also countered by some misses. Whereas Ditko was able, he was working on far fewer books. So he was able, like, each issue out, be like, all right, Stan wants some guy who, because, Stan's notes for a villain were like, I want a guy called Dr. Octopus. That was his notes. You know what I mean? Like, I want a guy called the Sandman. I want a guy with electricity. So Ditko would just approach each of these characters and, like, how can I make these guys unique, but also ground them in a way where they stay unique to Spider-Man's world. Like, I mean, very few of these guys have extraordinary abilities where they shouldn't be fighting Spider-Man, and those that do, we've noted, kind of got transitioned elsewhere or, used in other contexts. And I mean, and while a lot of these villains are linked, most of these villains kind of come at it from the power and responsibility angle, whereas they get these powers, but rather than doing the right thing, they do the wrong thing, and that's what makes them Spider-Man villains. But from a look and visual and attributes and powers and all that, they're all very distinct, and I think that lends itself to this very big canvas for each character, for, like you said, for other creators to then come on and keep building on those stories. There's very few, and the few characters that I feel are bland, there's they didn't get used down the line, like even if Ditko or Lee had an attachment for them during this run, like the Enforcers. I think that's really why these characters have become so elevated and are so great. They're so different, and each one is so defined and has an interesting backstory, or at least has very unique powers that can be played around with.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's important to not de-emphasize the visual element of these characters. Like, they are such uniquely visual characters in their designs, and it's funny. We'll talk about Romita, and when we get to him, but for someone who's such a strong visual creator, it is strange that he was unable to really create villains that people would feel attached to for that visual reason. I mean, I don't think that the Rhino kind of makes sense, I guess, and the Kingpin too, but this guy was around for even longer than Ditko, and the visuals were just not as unique.
Yeah. I mean, even a guy like Mysterio, who can argue it's kind of a weird design. He's got a fishbowl on his head.
Yeah.
But it's so distinct, and you remember that villain, like it's like, how do you walk away from that story not being like, wow, that was weird, that was different,
I hope that fishbowl guy comes back.
Yeah, or Electro with his what do you call it?
Starfish face?
Yeah, his starfish cowl, or whatever you want to call it. It's pretty amazing. So that's why, I mean, this is, to me, the greatest rogues gallery in comics.
Well, I think this is a good place to table this conversation. I love Spider-Man's bad guys. I oftentimes turn out for the bad guys even more so than for the villain.
There you
or for
go.
The hero, I mean.
The bad guys. All right. Well, Dan, I'm going to take us home, all right? So thanks for joining us for our 5th episode of our first season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. Dan, our next episode will be out in about 2 weeks, September 13th, give or take. What's the title of that show?
It's going to be called Excelsior or Excedrin. Yep, we're going to be talking about the man, the legend, the controversial figure, the guy who could sell the clothes off of his back. It's Stan the Man Lee. Nice.
And we'll be talking about his legacy and the good and the bad of it, right?
Yeah, just who is this guy and why do we revere him and fear him so?
There you go. Also, for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast feed for this week's bonus episode. We don't have a new issue of Amazing Spider-Man this week, although be sure to check out our recent review of Amazing Spider-Man number 31. So instead, we're going to have Swarm back on the show and talk about a couple of B-books, including Spectacular Spider-Man, Spider-Men 2, and a couple of other Spider Office books. So for $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll get access to these exclusive episodes, including new issues, Swarm stuff, mailbags, everything else that we put into that feed on the off weeks. And then also for $10 or more a month, you'll be sent an exclusive commissioned artwork in the mail every 6 months. Dan, this is all very exciting. Where can I see you pimping these wares on the internet?
Oh, you know me. I will be pimping these wares on Twitter at @SupSpiderTalk. Coming over and check me out, chatting about comics and Spider-Man and all these other things, getting into arguments with Dan Slott and so on and so forth. And then, of course, over at SuperiorSpiderTalk.com, we have all the awesome work that we're doing from all of our contributors, covering all the Spider-Man books and news and all that stuff so you can keep up to date. How about you, Mark? What are you doing on the internet this week?
Well, of course, you can find me on Twitter at ChasingASMblog, and you can find me on ChasingAmazingblog.com, although I haven't updated that site in a while again. We've gotten behind. And also SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. And, of course, please order my book, 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die, from Triumph Books. Find it at TriumphBooks.com or wherever books are sold.
And while you're remembering to buy Mark's book, we also want to be sure to remember the famous motto that closes out every one of our shows.
With great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.
And buy Mark's book.